Statues tell stories. In the center of a small Albanian town, a bronze George Bush stands frozen in gratitude. It's a symbol of how deeply the United States and Europe have shaped the Western Balkans. Aid flowed in, promises followed, reform was supposed to come next. But today something feels off. I want you to pause and ask a harder question. What if the fight against corruption backed by the West has produced the opposite of justice? What if the rush to prove reform has quietly weakened democracy instead of strengthening it? Across the Balkans, headlines celebrate arrests, crackdowns, and progress. Yet beneath the surface, institutions remain fragile, power more centralized, and legal safeguards thinner than before. Optics have replaced substance. If this analysis sharpens how you see reform narratives, stay with me, share it, think with me. Because to understand what went wrong, we first need to define the problem clearly. And that's where we go next. At its core, this story is not about individual scandals or isolated abuses of power. It is about how reform is measured, rewarded, and misunderstood. The European Union and the United States set clear expectations for accession states, fight corruption, strengthen the rule of law, prove institutional maturity. On paper, the logic is sound. In practice, it creates a dangerous incentive structure. When countries with weak institutions are judged by visible enforcement rather than legal integrity, outcomes become performative. Arrests matter more than convictions. Speed matters more than due process. Centralization feels efficient, even when it undermines accountability. Reform becomes something to demonstrate, not something to embed. This dilemma is not unique to the Balkans. It appears wherever states seek entry into powerful international systems. But in the Western Balkans, where democratic institutions are still consolidating, the consequences are magnified. What begins as external guidance slowly turns into internal distortion. And once that distortion takes hold, reversing it becomes far harder than initiating reform in the first place. To understand how this dynamic emerged, we need to step back and examine the historical and geopolitical context that shaped it. To understand why this pattern keeps repeating, we have to look at how the Western Balkans entered the reform cycle in the first place. After the conflicts of the 1990s, stability became the overriding priority. The United States and the European Union stepped in not only as peace brokers but as institutional architects. Their message was consistent: align with the West, reform your systems, and a European future will follow. EU accession turned reform into a long technical process governed by benchmarks, reports, and timelines. Judicial independence, anti-corruption bodies, and specialized prosecutors became symbols of progress. For countries like Albania, Montenegro, and Serbia, these symbols were also geopolitical currency. Meeting them signaled loyalty, reliability, and Western alignment. But history matters. These states inherited weak courts, politicized administrations, and low public trust. Building institutions takes time. Accession pressure does not offer much, so reform followed the logic of cycles: satisfy external demands quickly, stabilize power internally, defer deeper change. Over time, the process rewarded appearance over resilience, and that set the stage for the first real rupture. That rupture came not quietly, but through a moment of visible crisis. The first rupture arrived disguised as success. New institutions were launched. Anti-corruption raids dominated headlines. Western officials praised bold steps forward. But inside these systems, something had already shifted. In Montenegro, sweeping justice reforms promised independence and accountability. Yet EU reports later confirmed the opposite: political gridlock, weak oversight, and a judiciary still vulnerable to state capture. Reform existed on paper, power remained untouched in practice. In Serbia, the crisis was sharper. When USAID funding disappeared in January 2025, the reaction was immediate. NGOs were raided. Critics were labeled threats to national security. Instead of following rule of law procedures, the state chose intimidation. Reform language became a weapon. This moment exposed the illusion. Institutions designed to fight abuse were now enabling it. Enforcement tools, once praised, were turned inward. The goal was no longer justice, but control. If this feels familiar, it should, because this was not a failure of individuals. It was a failure of design, and that design flaw runs deeper than any single crisis. What failed was not the idea of reform, but the mechanism chosen to deliver it. Western-backed legal reforms across the Balkans leaned heavily toward a prosecution-led model, independent on paper, insulated in structure, detached from democratic checks. The assumption was simple: strong prosecutors would neutralize corruption faster than slow, consensus-driven courts. But power, once concentrated, rarely remains neutral. When prosecutors operate with minimal oversight, independence can quietly mutate into impunity. Decisions about who to investigate, when to detain, and how long cases remain open become political leverage even without explicit political orders. External actors reinforce this imbalance unintentionally. Progress was measured through benchmarks, arrests, and visible action. Funding, praise, and accession momentum followed numbers, not norms. So institutions adapted. They optimized for deliverables, not justice. The result is a system that looks credible to outsiders but feels arbitrary to citizens. A system where legality exists, yet legitimacy erodes. And once that trust fractures, the consequences don't stay confined to courtrooms. They spill into the streets, into politics, and into the next crisis. The second crisis was quieter, but far more destabilizing. It unfolded not through explosions or protests, but through prolonged detention and legal limbo. In Albania, the justice system crossed a line from enforcement into uncertainty. High-profile cases began to stack up. Former President Ilir Meta was detained, triggering accusations of politicized prosecution. The arrest of ethnic Greek mayor Fredi Beleri raised alarms about minority rights. But the most revealing case was still unfolding. The mayor of Tirana, Erian Veliaj, sat in pre-trial detention for nearly a year without formal charges, even after a constitutional court ruling reinstated him as mayor in November 2025. Arrests multiplied, convictions did not. Pre-trial detention became routine rather than exceptional. Investigations remained opaque. Oversight was minimal. To outside observers, this looked like resolve. To citizens, it felt arbitrary. Then came the geopolitical shock. In late January 2025, President Trump abruptly halted U.S. funding for SPAC and Albanian judicial reform. It was an implicit admission. The model had gone off course. What was meant to protect democracy was now exposing its fragility. And that fragility would soon be felt not by institutions, but by ordinary people. Now, shift your perspective. Forget institutions. Forget geopolitics. Put yourself inside the system. If you are a citizen, the message is chilling. Justice no longer feels predictable. It feels selective. You don't know whether the law will protect you or target you. You don't know how long an investigation might last, or whether detention means guilt or simply inconvenience to power. For you, pre-trial detention is no longer an exception. It's a threat hanging in the background of public life. Mayors disappear from office, politicians vanish into legal limbo, and the silence that follows teaches a lesson faster than any verdict ever could. This is how fear enters a democracy quietly, not through tanks but through uncertainty. Not through censorship, but through deterrence. People stop speaking. Journalists hesitate. Civil society recalculates its risks. If you care about justice, this is the moment to pay attention. Share this analysis. Talk about it. Because when trust in the law collapses, it doesn't just punish the powerful. It reshapes how an entire society behaves. And that behavior doesn't stop at national borders. What happens in the Western Balkans never stays there. These countries sit at a strategic crossroads between Europe, Russia, and the Middle East. When their legal systems weaken, the shockwaves travel outward. For the European Union, flawed reform creates a credibility problem. Accession is built on the promise that EU standards export stability. But when arrests replace due process, enlargement begins to look like risk, not reward. It fuels skepticism inside member states and slows the entire project. For the United States, the cost is strategic. Judicial models, once promoted as democratic safeguards, are now cited as examples of overreach that undermines Western influence at a moment when alternatives are aggressively marketed by authoritarian powers. And for global institutions, the lesson is sobering. When legal reform becomes performative, it teaches governments how to simulate compliance while hollowing out substance. That template can spread. This is no longer just a Balkan story. It is a test case for how the West exports norms in a competitive world, and the outcome will shape what comes next. The future now splits into three possible paths. In the best case, reform is recalibrated. The international community shifts its focus from arrests to rights, from speed to safeguards. Pre-trial detention is restricted. Oversight is strengthened. Prosecutors remain independent, but accountable. In this scenario, trust slowly returns and accession regains its meaning. In the middle path, the system limps forward. High-profile cases continue. Headlines satisfy external observers, but citizens remain skeptical. Reform exists, but only just enough to prevent collapse. Stability is preserved, progress is shallow. In the worst case, the current model hardens. Selective justice becomes normalized. Detention replaces deliberation. Power concentrates further. EU accession stalls, not because of resistance, but because credibility is gone. Democracy survives in form, not in function. History suggests systems do not correct themselves automatically. Incentives matter, design matters, and once institutions drift, they rarely drift back without pressure. The question is not which future is possible, it's which one is being chosen right now. And that brings us to the final insight. The deepest lesson here is uncomfortable. Corruption is not defeated by force alone, and democracy is not strengthened by bypassing its own principles. When justice becomes a performance for outsiders, it stops serving the people it was meant to protect. The Western Balkans were promised that alignment with the EU and the United States would bring dignity, fairness, and opportunity. Instead, many citizens now see a system where power hides behind legality and accountability feels selective. That is not reform, that is drift. Real change is harder. It requires patience. It requires due process over drama, institutions over individuals, and restraint over spectacle. Democratic integrity must matter more than headlines, benchmarks, or geopolitical signaling. If you found this analysis clarifying, don't let it end here. Share it, challenge the narratives you hear, demand better questions from those who claim to export democracy. Because the future of reform will not be decided in press releases or courtrooms alone. It will be decided by whether citizens and their partners are willing to insist that justice means more than arrest. And this conversation is only just beginning.